Hi, writers, and welcome to week one of this 6-week online Composition 1 course. The purpose of this video is just to walk you through some of what to expect in week one, as well as some of the key ideas and learning goals that we'll be focusing on as we move through the course. So this video will give you some really important background and contextual information to keep in mind as you begin to tackle the work from week one. So to introduce you to week one, we have three key types of coursework or three key goals for this week. Number one, introducing the course. So of course we have the getting started checklist, the syllabus, the schedule, information about the course, and the quizzes that support that information. There's also some information on avoiding plagiarism and information about AI and why, as a composition program, we do not use AI in Composition 1. So that information is equally important before you proceed with the week one coursework. We will also be reflecting on the topic for the course. So the first exercise you'll do will ask you to reflect on the idea of college, and that will be the topic that we continue using for the rest of this course. Finally, we are beginning to talk about academic reading and annotation, and we'll talk a little bit about the key text that we're going to be encountering this week and some ideas about how you might go about responding to that text. So a little bit of a preview of paper number one, just so you understand why we're working on some of these skills. In week two, you'll get more of an introduction to paper number one, but paper number one will be a summary response paper. So the first goal in the paper is to be able to summarize a complex text. So we're working on understanding complex sources, making sense of those ideas, and considering multiple perspectives and perspectives that may not be aligned with the perspective that we have coming into the text. Then secondly, we're working on response skills. So our own ability to connect to the text, to think critically about the ideas that those texts are offering to us. And then in responding to text, to be able to actually enter academic conversation. So conversations about complex topics that are already happening. Writing a paper is a way of stepping into those conversations and using your own voice to express your ideas clearly about those topics and issues. Keeping in mind a few keys to successful summary and response, and I will refer to these over and over as we think about how to make paper number one really effective. When you are working on summary response, one of the key things to demonstrate is that you clearly understand the text. So accurately represent not only the main idea of the text, but some of the more subtle subpoints of the text. The second key is critical thinking. So the best summary response papers show a very sophisticated level of critical thinking. You are making insightful points. You are making interesting connections to the text. And we also want to make sure to avoid simplistic responses. So that would be something like agree. I just say, I agree with it all, or I disagree with the whole thing, and sort of dismissing the ideas of others. Instead, we want a really careful engagement, really get in there and think about the subtleties and the details of the text, of the concept, of the topic. And so that way we're avoiding sort of superficial or overly simplistic ways of responding. Your response also needs to be rooted in respect for other people's ideas. So even if you do find yourself disagreeing or even frustrated by some of the ideas that you encounter, you're always voicing your response in a respectful way. And the third key to successful summary and response is development. So as you summarize, you're going to focus on pulling out some of the key points. And as you respond, you're going to focus on adding examples from your own experience, adding your own explanations that support the points that you want to make. So understanding the text, thinking critically about the ideas in the text, and then your own development of the ideas that you are bringing forth in your own paper. So keeping these things in mind, let's now start to think about the course topic. So the first exercise is going to ask you to reflect on your own ideas about the purpose of college. So I want you to sort of think about your reasoning for why you decided to come to college. Oftentimes, too, we have one first response. So, I want to be a teacher and I need the degree to do that. But I want to challenge you to think even more deeply than that. So sometimes we think about like the five whys. So, okay, I want to be a teacher, but why? And then think about why in response to that. And that might get you a little bit deeper in your thought process. I also want you to think about not just for yourself, but in general, what do you see as the main benefits of college or of having a college education? So, in general, our question here for paper number one, and a question that we're going to be grappling with throughout the course is what is the purpose of college? What is college for? To help us have a good conversation about this question, we're going to be reading not the whole book, but a chapter from the book Excellent Sheep, The Miseducation of the American Elite and the Way to a Meaningful Life. So, Excellent Sheep by William Derechowitz, who was a former Yale professor. He's an author and an essayist. And we are reading chapter 5 of this book, which is called What is College For? And so, in this chapter, William Derechowitz talks about his opinion, his theory on the purpose of college. Importantly, he begins his essay by talking about what a lot of people seem to think college is for, and then he responds and disagrees with that. So, from some of the first paragraphs of the book, return on invest or the chapter, excuse me, return on investment. That's a phrase you often hear today when people talk about college. How much money will you get out of doing it? In other words, relative to the amount that you have to put in. So he says most people think about college in terms of deciding if it's worth it, while financially, will it pay off? He responds to that common way of thinking about it. What no one seems to ask is what the return that college is supposed to give you is. Is it just about earning more money? Is the only purpose of an education to enable you to get a job? What, in short, is college for? And then he begins to respond. He says, education is more than the acquisition of marketable skills because you are more than your ability to contribute to your employer's bottom line or the nation's GDP or the nation's economy. So he has a really strong response to this sort of common way that we talk and think about the purpose of college. So, just to preview a little bit of the ideas in the text, again, he says the main purpose of college is not, in his opinion, actually to get a job or to become more employable. So, as we read the source, we are first thinking about summarizing the source, which requires first just understanding the source clearly. So, the first goal when you're reading any complex text should be just to fully understand the author's ideas. That does require reading with an open mind and fully considering their perspective. Your response is valid, but as a first step, we want to just think, what are they saying and why might they be saying this and what validity or what good points might they have? As you read too, be sure to pay attention to the details of the argument, the types of evidence they're using. When do they pull in factual evidence? When do they pull in their own experience? When do they pull in opinion? And consider the author's purpose. What is their goal in expressing this idea to the world? What are they hoping to accomplish? Then we'll move toward responding to the source. So beyond just summarizing what the author says, although that is the first step, what do you think about some of the finer points of the author's argument? So as you read, you'll be annotating and consider those responses. What are the parts of the argument that you have the strongest response to or the most thoughtful response to? But then we also have to consider why we're having the response that we're having. Maybe we think our background is different from the authors. Maybe our experience could potentially be different from the authors. Maybe we're coming in with, something like a preconception. So, not just thinking, here's my response, whether that's emotional or whether that's an intellectual response, but why is that my response? And you want to be able to try to articulate that. It makes the paper a little more complex if you can. So, as you're reading, you can think about the following questions and how they might guide your response. Is the text giving you any new ideas? Whether you agree or disagree, is there anything new or interesting that this text presents? What parts of the text or what statements are the most thought-provoking for you? Is the text bringing up any key issue or a key question that you feel is deserving of further conversation? And what's your opinion? What's your stance on that question? Of course, you can look for points in the argument that you agree or disagree with. And I challenge you to try to find some of each. And we don't always have to be black and white. I totally disagree or I totally agree, but what about this is valid? What might they be missing? Or how could they take this a little bit further? Try to be a little more subtle in the way that we think about the ideas of sources. And of course, any connections that you can think of to the source. And keep in mind too, beyond just thinking, what is my response or what types of response can I have? Why are these my responses? What knowledge, what experience, or what values do I hold that led me to have that response? So we're thinking critically not only about the text, but also thinking critically about our response to the text. So, again, just a reminder, exercise number one is going to ask you to reflect on the topic itself. So, that's sort of a journal or reflection based assignment. Exercise number two is going to ask you to read and annotate Derechowitz, noting some of your responses in your annotations. These two assignments are going to set you up really well to be able to dive into preparing for the paper, which will happen in week two. As always, let me know if you have any questions and good luck this week.